It's been just over a week since the storming of Capitol Hill by a pro-Trump mob. And what a week it's been. President Trump has been impeached for the second time. That's a first for any sitting president. While Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook have all suspended his accounts. Many of his followers then moved to Parler, an alternative social media platform. But Apple and Google quickly removed Parler from their app stores, and Amazon Web Services removed Parler from its cloud. Effectively, that deleted the platform from the internet. Silicon Valley has never quite flexed its muscles in this way before, which is why it is on this week's Spectator cover. I'm joined again by Amber Athey, the Spectator's Washington editor, and also by Peter Greenberger, former head of political advertising at Twitter and Google. Peter, let me come to you first. You once said that you were proud of Twitter's commitment to free speech. Are you still proud of it?
I am. I am proud of what the company has created over the last decade or so, creating a platform where people from all walks of life, whether you're an elected official or an everyday citizen, can have your voice heard and to be able to read and comment on and share what other people are saying. I am also proud of what they've done just recently. I don't think this is something they took lightly. I don't think this is something they ever wanted to do. And as Jack Dorsey has said just recently, he sees this as a failure, actually, on their part, that they weren't able to maintain a healthy conversation. I disagree. I think it's a larger societal and electoral and even governmental failure. But still, I think their hand was forced.
But are you comfortable with the idea that who should be on Twitter or Facebook or others can be decided by a couple of billionaires in Silicon Valley?
I recognize, again, this is not ideal. It's not a place where we want it to be or where these companies want it to be. But I think what you have to understand is that this is not necessarily a question of the First Amendment or a question of free speech. It's a question of choice. And ultimately, these companies made the choice that they no longer wanted to assist in the dissemination or the hosting of information that they saw as, first of all, false, as misinformation, but also as dangerous, and which certainly led to, in large part, led to what happened at the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday.
So Mr. Trump has been suspended, we think, for life, because he was seen by them to be inciting violence, leading to these appalling scenes in Capitol Hill. But on Twitter, there is still a hashtag Kill Trump and a hashtag Assassinate Trump. And one of the tweets that goes with that hashtag is, someone take this clown, i.e. Mr. Trump, take him out now. These are all still on Twitter. Why?
If it violates their terms and conditions, they should bring it down. And I certainly haven't read or can't defend every tweet, but they have terms and conditions, which up until recently, there was this carve out under the newsworthiness label for heads of state to be able to tweet pretty much what they wanted. And I, as you mentioned, I had defended that for many years when I worked there and when I left. I think it is most times better to know what your leader is thinking than to have to guess. And in fact, we now are in that position where we hear that he is raging around an empty West Wing and we're not quite sure what's on his mind. Perhaps it would be better to know, but I will say his behavior has improved markedly now that he has lost his favorite toy.
There is a case against what Twitter and others have done, but that's not the case I'm putting to you. It's the consistency. It's the criteria. I mean, some people will find it strange that Mr. Trump has been banned for life from Twitter, but the Ayatollah in Iran is still able to tweet his bile against Israel, talking about how the regime will perish.
I think what they've done with Trump, however, now opens the door for them to take further action, which, again, is not where they wanted to be. But now that they have taken this very, very dramatic, important step, I think they can look harder at the policies that they've had. Again, the terms and conditions have been that ordinary users, you and I, cannot use the platform to threaten violence or incite violence against other people. Foreign leaders, however, have been able to tweet pretty much what they want. This is what crossed the line. Should it have been, Khomeini? Should it have been somebody else? Perhaps. But this is the time when they felt they had to make the decision. I will say that there has always been this complaint that it falls harder on certain segments. The fact is, going away from Iran back to the United States, conservatives in particular feel like they're being picked on. When you look at who's violating the terms and conditions, it's one side violating the terms and conditions at a much higher rate than the other side. Those are the accounts that have been taken down.
Hold on, let's have a look at that, because after all, we know that Black Lives Matter used Twitter and Facebook to organize their demonstrations, many of which ended in riot and violence in Portland and Seattle. Not one of them was closed down. There's a Twitter account called Pigs in a Blanket, Fry 'em like bacon. Pigs in a blanket, fry 'em like bacon, referring to the police. It's a call to kill police. That Twitter account is still up as well. So ordinary people can incite violence, and Twitter has done nothing about it.
I would disagree. Again, I would say on the main, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. There are millions of accounts tweeting out millions of pieces of information every day. When things are flagged and things clearly violate the terms and conditions, they make an effort to take them down. Again, there's been this accusation that it's based on partisanship. When studies have been done, they have seen that more people are making violations on the right. There is a segment of the population in the United States that believes things that are completely untrue, and it's because the leaders of the country, the elected officials of the country, and some main conservative outlets peddle in this lunacy. Even just the other day, you had a member of Congress refuse to admit who's going to be the next president, or that he was elected rightfully. We had an election. It was as transparent as every other election we've ever had, and yet for some reason, certain members of the government refuse to acknowledge it, and they're inciting this madness. So there are different levels, I think, of misinformation, and it's hard to pinpoint. We had a Justice Potter here who said, when defining something else, I'll know it when I see it. And I think finally Twitter decided they knew it when they saw it, information that they no longer wanted to host on their platform.
Can you give any examples of the Black Lives Matter organizers using social media to organize what became violent protests? Can you give any examples of them being taken down?
I don't have them handy. I'm sure they did take down organizations and people that have incited violence on the other side. The fact is, though, that they haven't incited this type of violence. It's just a mistruth. And this comparing
Black Lives Matter have not incited any violence.
Not in as direct a fashion as the President of the United States giving a speech to what essentially was an angry mob and directing them to the United States Capitol. People marched in the streets to provide rights for people that have not had equal rights in this country for 400 years, and that's just a different matter.
So the people who have caused the consistent violence in Seattle and in Portland are in a different category from those who caused the violence in Capitol Hill last week?
I condemn all violence, as everyone has, but yes, I would put it in a different category, actually. But either way, Twitter needs to enforce their rules equally, and I think now that they've taken this action against the president, they will take a harder look at not only other other leaders, other people in power, but also other organizations who use the platform.
Was it right to ban links to the New York Post story about Hunter Biden?
That was a very difficult choice for them to make, and that's something that I think people can certainly debate freely. I think that the company themselves took a step back from that and recognized that maybe that was not the best decision that they made. But that's a hard question for them to answer, and I think that's what all these social media companies and news organizations have to answer for. What I'll say is that we have all learned a lot from 2016. There were cable networks who aired then candidate Trump's rally speeches from start to finish well before he was a frontrunner because it made great TV. Now, when he is speaking at the lectern in the White House press briefing room, there are cable networks that will go away from him if he starts speaking mistruths. That's a remarkable change. Similarly, the social media companies would publish and post and share anything and everything related to the election under the guise of sticking to freedom of expression 4 or 5 years ago. Now they're putting some limits on that. So do you allow stories to spread that are blatantly mistrue is the first question. But of course, a very important question, as you raise, is who's the arbiter of truth? And these companies have said that they do not want to be the arbiter of truth. But the problem is there is no arbiter of truth. And that's what we're figuring out. Even if you're an elected official, it turns out you can say whatever helps you raise money and grift off your supporters.
In a sense, it's an issue of who guards the guardians. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But let me bring Amber in now. Surely it's only right that companies like Twitter and Facebook and others, they should not have an obligation to publish disinformation and incitement to violence.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. However, the problem with what they did to the president is that they actually punished him for behavior that occurred off of the platform. And Peter tacitly admitted this in one of his answers to you, Andrew. When Trump was actually removed from Twitter, they cited 2 specific tweets that he had sent that occurred after the Capitol riot and claimed that he was inciting further violence, but they had read that incitement into the tweet. It wasn't actually there. The first one that they had a problem with was him saying that he still believed the election was stolen. And the second one is, and I think this quote is pretty accurate, although I'm paraphrasing slightly, for those who have been asking, I will not be attending the inauguration on January 20th. That was the second tweet from the president that they cited as incitement of violence. If you can be punished for things that you say or behavior that you engage in off of the platform, then that means the terms of service of these various social media platforms are phony.
Peter?
Well, I was going to say, if you can't take into account real life events, then I'm not sure we want anyone over there trying to arbiter or divine the interpretation of what Donald Trump's tweets are. It was very clear that he continues to perpetuate this idea that he won this election in a huge landslide and it's being stolen from him and his fellow patriots. That's ludicrous. He lost the election. Everybody knows he lost the election. I'm almost a little bit worried thinking that maybe he doesn't know. It was either he's completely delusional.
He might be the one that doesn't know.
He might be, which I don't know what's scarier. If this is A, he really believes this stuff, B, he was just playing a game to raise money and he doesn't like to lose, or C, he really was plotting something more nefarious, right? And I think it's probably a combination of all three. But it's very clear what he's doing. And Amber, we knew where this would go. If you're part of a doomsday cult that says January 15th, the world is going to end, the sun rises on January 16th. What does everybody do who has spent the last 6, 12, 24, 48 months preparing for the end of the world? It's not coming. Biden will be inaugurated on January 20th. We've always known that. And for some reason, a sizable percentage of the American population refuses to believe that reality because they're being egged on by our leadership, frankly.
Amber?
Well, if you knew that this was going to happen, then why did these social media companies not ban the president sooner? Why is there retroactive action being taken? And I would also ask why there are multiple tweets from Democratic officials that remain up after the 2016 election where they were questioning whether or not that election was legitimate. Nancy Pelosi has a tweet from 2017, for example, where she says that this election was not legitimate and that the president is not the true president. So why is one of those inciting violence and the other is not?
Well, I think you've just answered your question. One of them did not incite violence and the other one did, first of all. And second of all,
tweets from the president that led to his suspension were tweets that were characterized as having the potential to incite violence after a violent event had occurred. In the same way, you could read the same thing into Pelosi's tweet. There were riots all over D.C. where people were smashing store windows and burning down the city during Trump's 2016 inauguration, and Pelosi was questioning the election in 2017. So why was hers not given the same characterization as the president's?
Because I'll disagree, and I'll say hindsight's 2020, and there have not been mobs of people roaming the streets and certainly not breaching the sacred grounds of the U.S. Capitol, arguing that Nancy Pelosi or her party should be in charge of the White House. That it just didn't happen, and this kind of both sidesism that we've gotten accustomed to, I think, hopefully also will die a death here. But I'll also note that on October 19th, I did write a piece in the Washington Post calling for Facebook and Twitter to mute the president. I considered calling on them to mute both the president and Joe Biden, but I'm not sure anybody is reading Joe Biden's tweets as closely as they're reading the president's. They're not quite as interesting, but they're also not inciting this type of nonsense and ignorance and violence out in the country. So I would just disagree with on the face of it. I think that what people said about the presidential election in 2016, first of all, there were investigations about it. So there was at least enough of a there where people did suspect that there were some things going on that were not above level. But I'd also say that there was not violence. There hasn't been violence, certainly not to this degree.
I think what does concern people, Peter, though, is the sense of unaccountable power. Whether you agree with what Twitter has done, whether you think it's biased, that it tends to go for those on the right rather than the left, the bigger issue is unaccountable power, particularly when they seem to act in concert. I mean, these are companies far bigger than the oil, the railways, the steel, the robber barons at the end of the 19th century in America. They've got much more money and much more influence. And yet Twitter bans Trump for life, and you've given the reason why, and incitement to violence is something that there's not a right to that in free speech. But Trump's people then say, all right, we're going to move to Parler and we can do stuff there. And then immediately the rest of big tech closes that down as well. The apps you cannot get either from Google or from Apple. And Amazon says, we ain't hosting you anymore. That's a cartel. In America, cartels are illegal.
I think that's something that the new Congress, both sides, have an interest in, and the power of big tech and whether they're using that power correctly or whether they should have that much power is something that should be looked into, and I have no doubt that it will be investigated. Ironically, though, should Section 230, for instance, which provides these platforms with the protection not to be liable for everything that people post, ironically, you remove Section 230 and Parler and Gab are gone in 30 seconds. I don't think they want to be held liable for the information that's on those platforms, and they'll learn how hard a job this is to try to monitor it. So that's a problem. And I hear your point.
When the platform said, look, we're not a newspaper. We're not. I mean, if we publish in the Spectator an incitement to violence or something that's libelous or defamatory or whatever, we are subject to the full force of the law. It can cost us a lot of money. The editor, in some circumstances, could go to jail. The social media platform said, we're not publishers. We're just a platform. We're a neutral platform. And so therefore, we're not responsible for what appears. But suddenly Mr. Dorsey and Mr. Zuckerberg are saying, actually, we are responsible. That's why we're taking the president down, because he's inciting violence. It's why we are closing down Parler, because it's full of insidious, toxic stuff. The moment you do that, you need to be regulated and subject to the law of the land.
I'll quote Senator Mitt Romney, who at one point was looked upon favorably by the Republican Party. I'm not sure he is by everybody anymore. But he mentioned that corporations are people in a different context. Corporations are people in that they are made up of people making decisions. Want to talk about the First Amendment? The First Amendment means being able to say what you want and do business with whom you'd like to do business with. So ultimately, this was a choice. Am I comfortable that they all acted in concert? No, I'm not. But I can say that my guess is it's more about one person making a decision, everybody else looking around and saying, those guys don't seem to want to do business with people trafficking in conspiracy theories, nonsense, lies, and violence. You know what? We don't have to either. And in fact, we may end up being liable for it, depending what happens in the next Congress. So the power of the tech companies must be looked into. I think even they have called for, Zuckerberg, you mentioned, he has called for regulation. He doesn't want to be put in this position, in his own words.
Let me go back to Amber. Don't the Republicans only have themselves to blame? They have been in a position, Amber, for the past 4 years to do something about this. Maybe to take a leaf out of Teddy Roosevelt's book. He was a Republican president, admittedly rather different more distinguished president than Mr. Trump, but he was at the forefront, along with McKinley as well, of bringing in what became the antitrust legislation against the robber barons in America. But Amber, the Republicans did nothing about this when they had the chance to do it.
You're exactly right, Andrew. This is a major failure of the Republican Party. There were whispers about things like antitrust regulation or Section 230 reform by some members of the Republican Party, notably Senator Josh Hawley, Congressman Matt Gaetz. But outside of just a few Republicans, this was not something that was very popular. The cry from the free market conservatives was that these are private companies and therefore they get to decide who is allowed on their platforms. But when these companies start acting in coordination with one another and control so much of the internet that they can summarily ban a competitor, then that's when you start to get into an antitrust situation. And in fact, Jack Dorsey said in his statement explaining the banning of the president from multiple platforms yesterday by claiming that they had not acted in coordination with one another. However, Twitter did say from their public policy team that when they were looking at misinformation and the spread of misinformation in the Ugandan election, that they had all acted in coordination. I can't think of a better case that a company would make against its own monopolistic behavior than what Twitter admitted to just a couple of days ago.
Peter, let me finish with you. The Democrats at the moment, they now control the White House. They've got a casting vote majority in the Senate. They've got a smallish majority in the House, but they're in charge of these three key parts of government. They must think that so far the big tech people have censored those that they think should have been censored. They're way on the opposite side of the aisle, sometimes way out on the far right bit of the aisle. Will they have an appetite to do anything about big tech in the next couple of years?
I think they will. I mean, certainly Senator Warren has been very vocal on this, was very vocal on this during the campaign, as well as some other more left of center Democrats in the Senate and the House. I think there are concerns to be raised. This is not something that we've seen in a while in the United States, at least since we last took antitrust action. These are very, very large, very powerful companies who have gotten to a point where they have such influence that I think that the government should take a look. And I think that will happen really regardless of who's in power. I think there's appetite on both sides now. But, you mentioned, Andrew, when you asked Amper, do the Republicans have themselves to blame? And in this case, I think the answer is yes. The Republicans do have themselves to blame. They have not been a responsible political party. And there's a reason why their base has become unhinged from reality. And they have a responsibility to tell the truth to their base, to stop the big lie, and hopefully that will improve the situation in society, because ultimately social media is a mirror of society. It's only going to be as good or as truthful or as valuable as the people who are posting on it.
All right, Peter, we'll leave it there. Peter and Amber, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's early where you are in the morning, and we're grateful for your time and your contributions. Thank you both.